Hi, grade 12s. It's me, your teacher. So, I got a couple of complaints in the parent group that people don't have the data necessary to watch the videos. So, I think what I'll do going forward would be I'll make the videos and then I'll make a separate voice note that I can then share with the parents who will then have to share the children. Um, just to make it clear to parents why I'm using video as a medium, is that history requires what we call source analysis, and you cannot analyze a source if you cannot see it. So, yes, I can just explain the work, but it's also very important to engage with the work, which is why I'm making these videos. Right, so once I've said that, let's slide to the spot. Let's go back to what we did before and come to what we're going to do today, and then have a look at what we're going to do next time. So, what we did before was we looked at Cuba before 1959, and we looked at Cuba after 1959. Really, really short summary. Fulgencio Batista, very pro American, has a capitalist Cuba that basically takes advantage of ordinary Cubans. They have a revolution. Fidel Castro takes over and he starts implementing anti American ideas like nationalism. And America responds by refusing to buy Cuban sugar. Castro turns to the Soviet Union for help and allows the Soviet Union to establish missile bases in Cuba. Right, so how did this crisis start? So basically, in 1962, a crisis involving the island of Cuba brought the superpowers to the brink of a nuclear war. The USA had played an important part in Cuban affairs since the beginning of the 20th century. They had built a huge naval base at Guantanamo, and American companies invested heavily in Cuba, especially in the mining and agricultural industry. The USA also assisted the Cuban military officer Fulgencio Batista to take power in 1934. He made himself a dictator, but his government was not popular. It was corrupt and harsh. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista. So that is basically what I have explained already. I don't think I need to go into too much detail about that, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is just a profile on Fidel Castro. You can read through it on your own at your own leisure. But basically, it just explains why Americans didn't like Castro and how it led to the USA to support the Bay of Pigs invasion. It also tells you a bit about what he wanted. Um, so let's go next, the American response. So, like I said previously, America was very concerned to see an island so close from its southern coast becoming communist and friendly with the USSR. The Americans feared that Castro's ideas might spread to other countries in the region. His policies also threatened American companies in the island. So let's just refer to, we have explained all of this already. But basically, remember I told you about the Red Scare, this idea that communism was going to spread, it's going to come to America, and they're going to take your businesses and they're going to take your jobs. So that is why Americans were fearful of Cuba and fearful of Cuba making a partnership with the USSR as well. Um, then if you read here his policies, these policies they are referring to is the nationalization of the American businesses in Cuba. So what ended up happening was that Cuba took over American businesses and they made them into Cuban businesses, meaning that the people who built up these businesses from the ground ended up losing all their money that they invested into that business. So a lot of people felt very threatened by this. Now you will remember that Cuba had, so what the USA did was that they refused to buy Cuban sugar. And in October 1960, they ended all trade with Cuba. So it goes beyond just buying sugar. Now they don't want to trade for anything. In January 1961, they cut off diplomatic relations with Cuba. So they didn't even want to talk to Cuba. You can think of it like children, really. Like one child does something that the other child doesn't like, so they just don't talk to that child anymore. The Americans hoped that these measures would starve Castro into submission because, like I said, Cuba is now losing lots of money since this massive superpower is no longer trading with them. However, they had the opposite effect, driving the Cubans even closer to the Soviet Union. The Americans realized that among the aid that Castro was receiving from the USSR were weapons. So basically, Americans cut off all contact with Cuba in hopes that they would cripple the economy of Cuba, and basically force Cuba to abandon its communist principles like nationalization and things like that. However, by doing that, Cuba didn't respond in the way that they wanted. What they wanted was for Cuba to abandon communist principles, but all that they did was that they sent the Cubans to the Soviet Union. So the Cubans went to see Khrushchev, and they basically made a deal that the USSR would provide the Soviet Union with aid. Now, the aid that they were speaking about was aid in terms of economic aid and just bringing in food, trading with Cuba, buying Cuban sugar. That was what they were publicly saying. So the USSR would say very publicly, anybody can see they are trading with Cuba for sugar, they are trading with Cuba for whatever. But they did not mention, and this is very important, they did not mention that they were sending weapons to Cuba. So as far as the Americans knew, the only aid that Cuba was receiving was diplomatic aid and economic aid. However, because they didn't trust Cuba, they actually were actually spying on Cuba as well, and that is when they realized that they were weapons. So over here you can see an image of Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev. If you have a look over there, this one over here, this is Castro, and over here this man is Khrushchev. And you can see over here they have an image where they are holding hands. Now in the exam they might ask you to examine, why do you think that Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev took this picture? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Bing, 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 time up. So it wasn't a minute really, but I feel I'll be wasting time if I spend any more than that. But basically the reason that they took this picture was to show America the relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. So the whole point of taking this picture was basically to frighten America, to threaten America, to show America that Cuba has a big brother in his corner, and that big brother is the USSR. Right. So America is really freaking out at this point, and they decide they need to do something to stop this budding relationship, this growing relationship between Cuba and the USSR. And so what they do is that they support Cuban exiles. So this is actually something that I forgot to mention. But when Castro took power, he ended up chasing a lot of the wealthy, rich Cubans off the island. And these rich Cubans settled in America. They became known as exiles. Fulgencio Batista was also one of them. And they ran away and settled in America. And while they were in America, the USA decided to support an invasion of Cuba via the Cuban exiles. So remember in the past I told you about proxy wars? Apologies about the dog barking. Where instead of fighting directly, the USA would fight using their little puppets. Now the Cuban exiles were basically like the puppets of the USA. So they were Cubans who had been forced off the island by Castro, maybe mainly wealthy Cubans, rich Cubans, who had their businesses nationalized, as well as the Americans, in an attempt to overthrow Castro. So the CIA basically arranged that these exiled Cubans would get weapons, they would get planes, they would get guns, whatever they needed in order to go back to Cuba and get rid of Castro, basically. Because remember, I told you they tried to assassinate Castro and they did not succeed. So now they need to work through this means. So in Guatemala, the CIA trained the force of Cuban exiles. And in 1961, the American president decided to support an invasion by these exiles. This was called the Bay of Pigs invasion because the place where they landed was called the Bay of Pigs. So the whole idea of this invasion was that they wanted to establish a base in Cuba so that they could launch attacks against Castro. And they were very confident, even though there were very few Cuban exiles. Because remember, the rich is like 1% of the population. Once again, I'm exaggerating. But they hoped that when these people would return to Cuba, ordinary Cuban people will be on their side and help them take Cuba back from the communists. Unfortunately, the invasion in the Bay of Pigs was a disaster. 1,400 exiles landed, and they were supported by US bombers that were flown by the Cubans. They faced 20,000 Cuban troops. So the whole idea was that these people would then land in Cuba and then ordinary Cubans would join their side and help them fight. But that didn't happen. There was no popular uprisings to support the invasion, and the exiles that were not killed were taken prisoner. Kennedy denied all involvement in the operation. He said he didn't train these people, he didn't give them any weapons, he didn't give them any US bombers. But it was very, very obvious that he was actually involved because it's not on the slides, but just a fun tidbit. One of the bombers was shot down, and they actually saw that on the wing of the bomber was actually an American flag. So even though Kennedy denied any involvement, it was very, very obvious that these people were trained by the Americans to overthrow Castro. So it was a major humiliation for President Kennedy. Like, these massive superpower defeated by a group of 20,000 Cuban troops. So once that happened, Castro realized that there was no hope of entering into an alliance with America, and so he officially declared Cuba a communist state in December 1961. And because of the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was afraid that America would organize another invasion. So he asked the USSR to provide arms being weapons, in order to defend Cuba against a possible American attack. So he's now paranoid. He thinks that America has already attacked him once, they can do it again. And maybe this time they won't do it through Cuban exiles, maybe this time they'll use their own troops. So the Bay of Pigs actually becomes the launching off point for the USSR to provide missiles to Cuba. Khrushchev agrees to provide the missiles, and he makes a public announcement in September 1961. Remember, up till this time, everything has been done kind of undercover. He secretly hopes to turn Cuba into a Soviet missile base. So the whole idea is they're going to use Cuba as a way to have missiles very close to America, because you'll remember America has missiles very close to the USSR. Now this makes the USA panic because they were scared of the spread of communism, and Kennedy stated that the USA would isolate or leave Cuba on its own, and warned the USSR not to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. So they kind of don't want anybody to trade with Cuba. They kind of don't want anybody to engage with Cuba. That is what it means to isolate somebody. And they don't want the USSR to put missiles in Cuba. So I'm going to stop it there. I think this is a good spot to stop. The next time I see you, we will be speaking about increasing superpower tension in 1961 to 1962. Thank you for your cooperation, I suppose, and I'll see you next time.